Ah, man, I do not want to cut my own hair again. Whew. So much blood last time. Alright, so here's an indie circuit festival hit that mashes up broad comedy, drug humor, old school sci-fi, horror, kung fu, Japanese monster movies, and Mexican wrestling films with the aesthetics of old video games and cyberpunk movies like Tron and Videodrome, with a gonzo storyline riffing on 80s Cold War action tropes, and your eyes are kind of glazing over right now, and I don't really blame you, because honestly, that was my initial reaction too, which feels kind of strange because all of that sounds so weird if you step back for a minute. But the thing is, it sounds weird in exactly the same processed, calculated, test-marketed, extremely familiar way that everything else weird brand popular culture has for the last 15 to 20 years or so, or whenever it was that you began to notice that Gen X and late millennial creators had a firm stranglehold on the general cultural concept of offbeat coolness that has been directing the flow ever since. You might not be able to describe this aesthetic in simple terms, but if you've ever browsed the merchandise area of a GameStop, glanced at the joke t-shirts at a fan convention, or tried to make heads or tails of the overnight programming on Adult Swim, or braved the midnight movie lineup at Genre Movie Fest, where materials like Jesus Shows You the Way to the Highway tend to become sensations, you're probably familiar enough with it at this point to be, well, a little tired of the same dozen remixes of points of reference. Yes, guy, I also remember big boxy electronics, watching badly dubbed inscrutable movies on scrambled cable, the absurdity of Reagan-era propaganda, and the realization that the David Cronenberg movies were about more than just the gross parts I rented them for. Do you have anything else? And what's tiresome about it is most of these don't have anything else, which is why even the better versions of this type are usually in short sketch form. But this is actually something kind of different. To start with, whereas much of what I'm describing is in fact so familiar is because it involves American pop culture recycling itself to itself, this is actually a quintessentially international production, the second feature from Spanish filmmaker Miguel Llansó, following up his post-apocalyptic adventure film Crumbs from 2017, and like that film, his new one was also filmed largely in Ethiopia with a global cast, and once again casts Ethiopian theater actor Daniel Tadasse in the lead role. Specifically that of a CIA agent named Gargano, who along with his partner are charged with protecting a virtual reality network called Psychobook from a marauding virus called Soviet Union by downloading their avatars into its mainframe to combat its avatar in the form of Joseph Stalin, with a virtual world represented by stop-motion versions of the characters wearing celebrity cardboard masks. Yeah. Something goes wrong during the virtual mission, which may or may not involve a double cross, putting Gargano into a real-world coma and trapping his mind in a second level of virtual reality called Beta Ethiopia, ruled by an evil version of Batman, and possibly involving a conspiracy surrounding a narcotic that can be trafficked between the real and digital worlds, Gargano's wife and her dream of opening a kickboxing school, and the eventual appearance of a figure who is probably not Jesus Christ, but may be the key to an entire other reality altogether and Gargano's escape. Also, the Ark of the Covenant, ninjas, and some bug monsters are involved. Look, it's not actually supposed to make sense, but at the same time does have an actual certain level of internal consistency, and that's part of the joke. But the bigger takeaway is that there's a real energy of inspired, genuine, handmade, creative, let's make something out of nothing zeal here being put together and celebrated that's wholly different from the more cynical reference for reference sake humor that initially seems to be imitating. It might take a minute or two to click into place since it opens in media res and there's a good stretch of action before we're into the, oh, hey, these are characters and not just non-stop jokes part, and yeah, a little of that goes a long way. And like a lot of these, it's eventually definitely just a little bit too long for its own good, but there is a theme and a point running through the aesthetic, if not necessarily the actual narrative, which really does add up to not much more than a takeoff on Inception-style puzzle box maze narratives. Essentially what we're seeing is a continuation of the fixation on pop culture detritus as totemic items that Llansó first explored in Crumbs, where the post-civilization characters carried around Michael Jordan memorabilia and Ninja Turtles figures as religious relics of the ancient world. Here, that theme gets blown out to full-on meta, not just as a background joke, but a world-building aesthetic with everything from chunky 80s technology, 70s political conspiracy storyline, cross-decade fashion, old film stocks, cheesy movie monsters, the outdated special effects, and especially the clearly not American characters talking about American Cold War patriotism in crudely dubbed English, all reinforcing the effect that we're seeing isn't domestic nostalgia trying to ironically justify itself, but in part a sincere view of the global South processing the secondhand cultural flotsam exported to it over the decades by the rest of the world into something, if not necessarily coherent, definitely different and refreshing. You know, thanks for the reruns and technology and irregular fit clothes, America. Here's some wild stuff it inspired. All told, I ended up being really taken with what it ended up as, just for the boldness and imagination on display. The technical craftsmanship that went into the production, especially once I realized how they were doing some of these effects and how difficult it must have been. I'm a huge fan of both the audacity in casting and obviously not a conventional movie star actor like Daniel Tadasse as a hero lead, and also how good he is in the part. I wish there was more to it, you know, in the narrative subtext beyond the bigger art piece metatext of pop symbolism versus religious symbolism and what's really the difference. I mean, after a while you get it. And that, for me, is what keeps it from being, since it's trying to be a full feature, from being as compelling as it otherwise would be. And that's why I can't really go higher than like a 6 out of 10, but regardless, I would still say that this is an unqualified recommendation. Its imperfections are wildly outshone by its originalities. The film is currently making the festival rounds and is available on the Arrow video channel streaming service, presumably for a wider video and streaming release after that. I definitely recommend you check it out when you can.